Greetings, Philosophy 244. I am giving my speech over the interview that I had with Dr. Robert Dubois, also known as Dr. Bob. During this speech, I'm going to try and not look at the camera too much because looking at your face during an interview, or during a speech rather, can only impede your performance, so I'm going to be making a neutral expression here at the tree in front of me. But anyway, I'll get into the interview that I had with Dr. Bob. So Dr. Bob is a professor of psychology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He is also an associate director of undergraduate studies, which means that he aids students in their future success and in their careers. So I got a couple of interesting takeaways from the interview. I also learned a lot about the many ethical issues that professors face, not only as psychology professors, but a lot of this was very useful to me because I'm interested in a career in either lecturing full-time in art history, English literature, or psychology, and Dr. Bob being a psychologist, that pertains to my interest in evolutionary psych. So interesting things I learned are that basically as a professor, even outside of the job, you're having to spend pretty much all your time staying up to date, staying smart, as Dr. Bob described it. So he basically spends 10 to 20% of his time, reading journals and articles and books and just insights into the psychology field. This may be different for other professions or for other fields because psychology is such a budding discipline. But so he spends a lot of his time studying other things too, though, that he can apply to the practice of psychology and teaching it, such as productivity and communication skills, public speaking, things like that. And he doesn't have a whole lot, not able to have time for a ton of hobbies. He studies music in his free time and such, but he says that not being able to have a lot of hobbies tells you a lot about what it's like to be a professor, and that it's very demanding, that this is one of probably the most demanding jobs in our culture. He also sees a lot of ethical issues in the profession, and a lot of these he addresses. Some of them he's not able to address because they're kind of rooted institutionally, and we'll get into those a bit later. But so those were some of the interesting takeaways I got from this. So as an educational psychologist and as a part-time administrator, Dr. Bob's job is about, I guess, probably 66% to 75% just teaching. And teaching includes, giving online lectures, giving live lectures, giving speeches to students and, around the campus. He, of course, as I said, is also an associate director for undergraduate studies, so he will get with students and they'll talk about future career paths, and this specifically is kind of important to one of the ethical issues we'll discuss later on, which is the role of the university in just teaching the students versus teaching and preparing them for careers. So currently Dr. Bob teaches 3 courses. Each of these classes demands multiple student engagements. He teaches, the 2 I know of are honors general psychology, which I took last semester, and abnormal psychology online, which I am taking this semester. So every single class, every individual class he teaches requires a few hours of preparation, getting ready to give the lecture, making sure everything you're saying is factually up to date, and so on and so forth. Also, there's a lot of time that's required to spend online grading and updating for classes, and this is kind of, I guess, the bureaucratic red tape every professor has to suffer for their job, is, grading all the students, because he's probably got about 100 or 150 students he's teaching, and so that's a lot of feedback to give. He also spends other time doing administrative tasks. As I mentioned earlier, he is a part-time administrator, and so in his case, he has to manage all of the social media, Facebook, Instagram, and all of that for the psychology program at UTK. And also, like I said, he has to stay up to date in the field, and we're going to get to this in an ethical issue about basically teaching what you know, even if you know it might be updated someday and changed to be a bit different. For example, we're in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual right now, number 5, and we're going to be approaching the DSM-6 pretty soon. With each DSM update, we're getting kind of just a paradigmatic change to what we know in psychology. So for example, a disease, something that's classified as a mental illness right now, might change in the future, sorry about that helicopter, might change in the future to be not a mental illness anymore, because psychology is a very dynamic field, and that's how every basically profession is whenever it first starts. I mean, psychology was founded, you could argue, with Freud, or I mean, people might say Plato, but really as a mainstream discipline, it was pretty much founded with Freud. And so yeah, he has to stay up to date. Dr. Bob also takes time to do extra things. He does workshops, like to keep students successful. One of these that he gives is called Don't Eat the Marshmallow, and this is kind of about our our ultimate animal nature and suspending our being able to prolong or delayed gratification rather than go and play, I don't know, a video game for a couple hours. Instead, maybe just work on your homework and then save that video game for a bit later. And so yeah, he gives these. He also organizes guest lectures across campus. He conveys ideas to other professors, makes sure that they have a network of communication about how to properly do their jobs. He also deals with academic misconduct, which hopefully is more sparse. And he meets with students, as I said, to discuss career plans, which is very important to some of his philosophy about being a teacher. So, as I said, he invests 10 to 20% of his time trying to stay smart, trying to read books and journals and all that, making sure he knows what he's talking about, because it is a very demanding job. And I think that's one of the things I find very interesting about being a professor, is that there's kind of this asymptotic kind of drive toward being the very best you can, but never getting there. So you spend your entire life just always in constant improvement. So now we'll get into some of the ethical issues that Dr. Bob talked about, and there were surprisingly a lot more than I expected. Whenever you see a professor, you might just think, okay, they're here to do their job, they're here to teach, but really there's so much more than that. And so one of these ethical issues that Dr. Bob mentioned was the currency of topics, and I talked about this a couple minutes ago, about the basically relevance of our current knowledge of psychology. We're on the DSM-5 right now, but by the time we get to the DSM-10, things might look completely different. I mean, there was a point whenever psychologists advocated ice pick lobotomies, that one Italian guy who went all the way through Europe basically doing tons and tons of lobotomies on people. And we look back at that now and we laugh at them and we just think, how could you ever have reached the decision to do that? But at the time, there were definitely a lot of people who thought that made perfect sense. And so whenever it comes to the currency of topics, it kind of makes me think of Wittgenstein's whole thing about true enough. The truth isn't something that's really the ultimate truth. It's only as true as we can make it out to be. And so Dr. Bob basically talked about his issue with teaching whenever you know that one day the stuff you're teaching might just be, complete BS. So he basically addresses this by letting us know during the course that, listen, I'm teaching you this psychology information right now, but one day it could be completely revolutionized, and it could be a lot different. So he basically, to address this issue, he lets us know. He gives us the awareness that what we're learning right now isn't the ultimate truth, and I feel like that's kind of something that's addressed a lot in philosophy, is that there's this kind of natural progression toward the truth, and who even knows if we're going that way, if we're even approaching the truth, but you basically, it's kind of philosophical suicide to declare that the ultimate truth. The Socrates quote, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. So another one of the ethical issues that Dr. Bob talked about was whether or not you're supposed to just teach the course material, or whether you need to really look outside the box, or think outside the box and think in terms of what the student's going to be doing with this course material one day. And so he talked about this mismatch. Students most of the time go to college because they want to come out with a degree and get their job. But a lot of the professors he talked about look at their job as just being a communicator of the knowledge. And so to address this, Dr. Bob will, give seminars, and he'll give talks about, like I said, don't eat the marshmallow, teaching delayed gratification. He'll also talk about just like career skills, like critical thinking skills and teamwork, being able to solve problems, being able to use technology. And so one of Dr. Bob's kind of ideas about addressing this ethical dilemma is that we instill perhaps a set of almost guidelines across all the classes, make sure that teachers are really being aware of the fact that they need to be teaching their students ways to get a job one day. Because, you know, you could have a kid who knows everything about the history of the Byzantine Empire, but he might have terrible conduct in class, and he might just make a horrible teammate with other people, and you just kind of look at him and you know he's not going to really get out there in the career world one day unless he really, you know, kicks it in gear and changes his lifestyle. And so that brings me to another one of Dr. Bob's issues, which is, do you tell a student that their behaviors are going to be impetuous to their success one day? And like I said, there's the solution of identifying a set of life skills that all the teachers could make sure that their students know, to change it from just being a class, you know, about teaching you about the history of, you know, Rembrandt's work, to being a class that teaches you about the history of Rembrandt's work, but also teaches you how to, maybe as an art historian or as an artist, be able to better analyze this work and be able to work with people and, you know, talk about opinions and argue and all that, kind of all these different things that you could use in an actual job one day, rather than just having the pure knowledge as it is. So another one of the problems that Dr. Bob talks about is basically the issue of your opinion on students and your subconscious biases towards students. And as a good psychologist, he acknowledges that, you know, no matter what, you see a person, you're going to make up an opinion about them, and that opinion is going to affect how you act toward them. There's tons of ways that psychologists describe this, the Pygmalion effect, and Dr. Michael Olson's research about subconscious racism and so on. But anyway, so Dr. Bob, he tries to, he has students, and he understands that he might have a student who acts a certain way and that makes him dislike the student. And so to remedy this, to make sure that this doesn't affect their teacher-student relationship, you know, in terms of grading and how he treats them, he tries to remedy this by, first of all, sitting down with his students and trying to get to know them as much as possible, have a good teacher-student relationship with them, and also to attend, you know, junctions that concern groups that he's not a part of. I mean, he'll go to Pride junctions to get to know the LGBT community better and understand how they work and things like that, other races, you know, junctions for, you know, Black Lives Matter and so on, I guess, as examples, but Pride junctions are what he mentioned. So that's something he tries to address, and just basically the subconscious understanding of students. And he also, whenever it comes to grading, he tries to use the anonymous function on Canvas so that he can't see the student's work that he's grading. And that way he can't, you know, be reading the student's writing and think, oh, well, they've done a lot better than this before, so I'm not going to grade them as well. But rather he can just think, okay, this is some random kid, it's good or it's bad. And another way he remedies this is with a set of standardized guidelines, like a rubric sometimes whenever he's grading work. You know, just check off the parameters. Did they do this, 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 and this? Okay, they get a good or a bad grade. Another one is spirituality, and this ties in with the whole idea of true enough and how much, you know, we know. And so there's the whole issue of kids who might come from a different religious background might think that might in which the scripture doesn't account for something like evolution. In this case, Dr. Bob's kind of his solution to this ethical dilemma is to, you know, kind of do the whole Wittgenstein, true enough, this is what we know based on the data. It might not be the complete truth, but it's what I'm going to teach because it's what we have with empirical evidence. And so he acknowledges that there are tons of different backgrounds, there are tons of different ideas flowing here and there, but he's just going to teach what he can teach with the baseline of what we observe and what we know. And he knows that science doesn't cover things like spirituality and all that. And so he tries not to let that, you know, seep into the whole practice of psychology. And so again, what we talked about earlier with the relationship between the students and teachers, he spent a lot of this is kind of an interesting anecdote I took from the interview, and it's that he spent a lot of his undergrad actually studying philosophy. And part of the reason for this was that his philosophy professor basically treated them like budding philosophers. The professor invited Dr. Bob and his class, or the future Dr. Bob and his class, to the professor's house for dinner one night, you know, had these discourses with them, and it really inspired a lot of them. And so this kind of, I'm going to tie in with Dr. Bob's idea of the teacher-student relationship. And this is kind of an issue we talk about a lot in professional responsibility. We talk about what is the professional's relationship to the client. Should a medical doctor get to know the patient really well, and should they be friends, and so on. And so what Dr. Bob says with this is that first of all, make sure the relationship is student to teacher. Don't have it be, friend to friend or anything like that. You gotta always make sure that it's a student conversing with a teacher, and that's it. But he does believe that you should have a personal relationship with the student, almost a friendship. Just kind of we've gotten to know each other, we know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we know each other as people, not as just objects that are here to, get a grade or something like that. And Dr. Bob ties this in with basically student motivation. And a lot of his students have come to him and basically said, you paying attention to me, you letting it pass that I came to class late that one day, that helped me a lot because it showed me I mattered more than just a student. And so this is kind of, he ties in with being able to teach better is being able to have the students trust you better. And so it all comes down to trust with Dr. Bob. And so as an instructor, he tries to make sure that his students know him well and so they can trust him, because that's part of the learning process. And basically that's the interview with Dr. Bob. I learned a lot about being a psychology professor, and so that's my presentation.